so what are some of the health benefits of fermented foods? And as I go throughout the lecture, it's not going to just be about repopulating the gut, which I think is one of the things that we associate with fermented foods, because yes, there are present bacteria and yeast that are very beneficial for our microbiome, but also by fermenting foods, we're actually altering the food itself and making it more nutritious. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so improved absorption of nutrients. So why does a cow chew its cud? The reason is because most vegetation is full of phytic acid, also known as phytates. What these do is they actually block the absorption of some key minerals: calcium, iron, zinc, magnesium. So when the cow is chewing its cud, it's basically utilizing another stomach that has some key microorganisms that produce phytases that decrease the amount of phytate so that the cow is able to absorb those nutrients. Another animal that, besides humans, that does not chew its cud are pigs. And in industrial farming, they know that if you just give pigs plants, it's not going to absorb the nutrients. So what do? They mix phytases, which are the enzymes that break down phytic acid, so that the pig can absorb the nutrient. Similarly, if we really want to make sure that we're getting the full benefit of, say, grains, a lot of our beans and vegetables, fermentation is a really great way by providing it with specific bacteria that can actually break down the phytic acid. In fact, actually, for example, quinoa and lentils, after they're fermented, you're seeing actually about 75 to 85% improvement in absorption of those nutrients. Okay, they keep us trim. So there's a couple reasons for this. As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, that if you take alcohol with oxygen, it produces acetic acid. So the acetic acid that's often produced in a lot of fermented foods, for example, sauerkraut, actually can help us with feeling satiated. And it also has a positive, or I guess you could almost say negative, effect on blood sugar. So it helps to actually reduce the glycemic index of the meal. And then the other thing that fermented foods can provide, and this is kind of very specific to the bacteria, specifically one bacteria, Lactobacillus plantarum, has been actually shown to help promote weight loss. Another interesting thing, and I'm not going to get too graphic about this, but in studies where they've taken, in mouse studies, when they've taken an obese mouse and a regular size mouse, and they basically transplant stool samples, which basically is going to be full of microorganisms, they find that when you transplant the stool microorganisms from the obese mouse into the thin mouse becomes overweight or obese. And then the opposite is true. So meaning that when they transplant the thin mouse into the obese mouse loses weight. Okay, they keep us in a good mood. So you might have heard of this idea around the second brain, or also the gut-brain axis. Well, as much as like our brain sends signals to our GI tract via the vagus nerve, our GI tract sends signals to our brain. And mostly one is that actually a lot of our neurotransmitters are produced in the gut, specifically serotonin, dopamine. These are all produced in the gut, and they rally over to the brain. Another benefit, so having the right bacteria can really affect that production. The other thing that, specifically getting the bacteria from fermented foods or just good gut bacteria in general, actually also helps with the absorption of omega-3 fatty acids. And omega-3 fatty acids specifically DHA, is very essential for mood health. The other component of how fermented foods can help with mood is they also help with the absorption of some key mood stabilizing nutrients, specifically magnesium and zinc. Okay, so if you were at my presentation last month and you learned a little bit about immune health, I did talk at length about both how the microorganisms in our body, but also how probiotics can definitely help with immune function. And there's a couple of ways that making sure that we're getting the right bacteria in can help prevent certain conditions or certain pathogens. So the first thing is when we bring in beneficial bacteria, they often bind to our epithelium, which are basically the cells that line many of our different tracts, our GI tract, our vaginal tract. They also line our alveoli and of our lungs. When we bring in the good bacteria, they basically adhere to the epithelium and prevent the adhesion of pathogens. And this is one of the things, so often in my practice, because I do work with a lot of women who either have recurrent urinary tract infections, UTIs, or chronic bacterial vaginosis, it's very important to bring in the good bacteria to prevent the adhesion of bacteria that you don't want, things like E. coli or Staph aureus. Also, another benefit of specifically beneficial bacteria is that they do produce substances that can actually kill bacteria and viruses, in fact, usually even respiratory viruses, which is one of the things I discussed in the previous presentation. Also, after the ingestion of specifically certain strains of bacteria, we do see a positive increase in white blood cells, which are basically the cells of our immune system, as well as our red blood cells. So bringing on some beneficial bacteria from fermented foods, both from a preventative, but then also is something I'll often recommend for patients who are fighting a cold or a flu, is to bring on some good, healthy gut fermented foods. Okay, they keep things going. So definitely one, probiotics have a lot of benefits, but even some of the other components of fermented foods, specifically fermented foods can increase the amount of acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter, and we need it, one, for peristalsis, so basically for our bowel movements. And they really do help, again, with making sure that things keep going. Another interesting thing about some fermented foods is, so I don't know if you've ever had heartburn or stomach aches, so sometimes we have that issue because our body isn't producing enough stomach acid. Believe it or not, we actually do need to produce stomach acid to break down protein, to absorb B12. But then sometimes we also can have the opposite end where we're producing too much acid, and that's causing issues. Well, interestingly enough, fermented foods actually, whether you're bringing in too much acid or too low acid, it does a good job at sort of bringing that back into equilibrium. So fermented foods can be really, really helpful in either side of that digestive issue.